In 1950, the city of Detroit was considered one of the greatest cities in America. Its economy was booming with car manufacturing jobs that led to it being deemed the Motor City. The 1950 census found Detroit to have a population of 1.8 million people, the vast majority of which worked within the auto industry. Fast forward to 2010, Detroit's population is 61% less than it was in 1950, with just 700,000 residents. The car manufacturing jobs that once were the foundation of the city's economy are no longer there. Detroit currently leads the country for the highest poverty rate, with a median household income of $26,000. Detroit is a sad and profound story of a city that once was one of the greatest places in America, turning into a decaying and impoverished wasteland. This magnificent transition has led many to ask why. There are many adequate answers, such as jobs were exported to China or that auto industry executives moved to other parts of the US with less pesky unions. Perhaps the most intriguing answer, however, is robots. While companies did export some jobs to countries where human labor was cheaper, the rate of car exports out of the US was not affected. On top of this, despite high poverty rates in Michigan, it still remains the nation's auto industry hub because robots are now making cars instead of humans. This graph shows us a recent history of Detroit's exports. Disregard 2009's dip because the stock market crashed and should be considered an outlier. Detroit's exports are higher than ever, and the city has the 14th highest GDP in the country. Yet despite this, the city had to file for bankruptcy in 2013. So while the history of Detroit tells us about the amazing rise and fall of a city, it also gives us the most worrying example of what America has to lose by integrating robots into the workforce. While the people of the city are suffering, industry is booming because it replaced human labor with robots who cost very little. In a study published in the National Bureau of Economic Research, researchers found that each additional robot added to the U.S. economy reduces employment by 5.6 workers. With no incentive for an executive to not go with the most efficient option, robots have begun to take jobs away from humans at an alarming rate. On top of that, it doesn't just hurt the workers who actually lose their jobs. According to that same study, every robot added to the workforce per 1,000 workers causes wages to drop somewhere between 0.25 and 0.5%. Even if you think you aren't affected by the integration of robots into your line of work, you actually are. So this brings up the question, will we be better or worse off after the rise of robots? After reading about Detroit, one might think the answer is clearly worse, but it's a bit more complicated than that. Detroit paints a great picture of how robots affect manufacturing, but it may be anecdotal in a broader sense. The US unemployment rate, despite the constant integration of robots into the workplace, is as low as any economist would want it to be. This is because the vast array of different job types is constantly growing in the United States. When robots replace one of these job types, a new one tends to emerge. One might attribute this to the invisible hand that is constantly making an economy as efficient as possible. Cases like Detroit, however, are very important to look at. Even though the rest of the US has thrived, no one wants to see history repeat itself with another Detroit scenario. We can do this by trying to identify when this might happen and focus on making sure it doesn't. In an article for Forbes titled, "How Much Will AI Decrease the Need for Human Labor?" economists split jobs into three different categories. One, stable or likely to see growth. Two, transitional areas. And three, declining areas. By characterizing an economy in these terms, we can paint a better picture of how at risk they are for another Detroit scenario. The first type of job, stable or likely to see growth, means robots have very little potential for replacing a job within that field. This includes areas like education, social services, or law-related jobs. Typically, these jobs are only going to benefit from future technology and have already made the transition to being more efficient. The second type of jobs, those that are in transitional areas, mean jobs that are going to see their roles become significantly more efficient. While this does include some white-collar jobs who are overpaid and underutilized, it mostly consists of production and manufacturing industry-related roles that have yet to be transitioned into a higher rate of efficiency with the use of technology. The third type of job, those that are in declining areas, are ones we are already seeing making significant cuts in employment. This includes any motor vehicle operating job that is being replaced by self-driving cars and warehouses that are turning to automated machines rather than human labor. The difference between declining areas and transitional areas are that declining areas have already started to significantly have an effect on the economy. Once we identify these jobs, how do we use the information to decrease the potential for another Detroit? The answer is to aim to create more stable jobs in correspondence to the loss of declining jobs. We already know that, in general, the invisible hand of economics tends to fix this problem by itself. But in areas like Detroit, where an entire economy is dependent on jobs that will soon be automated, action has to be taken. In extreme cases like this, the government needs to incentivize the creation of jobs in stable fields of work. It's important that they do this instead of penalizing the company who is using robots, because the company is not necessarily bound to a certain city or town and can export jobs to other areas, like China, where labor is cheaper. That scenario is lose-lose for the city because they lose the jobs anyways and did not dedicate resources towards creating stable jobs. It's becoming more and more clear that robots will inevitably replace a significant amount of jobs in the US economy. But if these jobs are replaced with stable jobs, we will be much better off because of the increase in efficiency that is a result of that happening. Robots make many aspects of life easier. Even if your current job is vulnerable to them replacing you, they ultimately increase our quality of life much more than we realize. As long as we are proactive in preventing another Detroit scenario, robots can do nothing but help us.